The female baboon Makena took her last breath with Legadema's jaws still locked around her throat, and the kill had been swift and efficient. A perfect example of the 6-year-old lioness's hunting expertise that had made her one of the most successful predators in this section of Botswana's Okavango Delta. Baboons were challenging prey because they were fast and intelligent and could climb trees where lions couldn't follow, and they lived in troops that provided mutual protection, making it dangerous to target individuals who might summon reinforcements that could mob and injure an attacking lion. But Makena had been separated from her troop, isolated and vulnerable, and Legadema had seized the opportunity with a decisive precision that separated successful predators from those who went hungry. Now the baboon lay motionless on the ground, dead, and Legadema released her grip and stepped back to assess her kill before beginning to feed, following the instinctive protocol that all big cats employed to ensure prey was truly deceased before letting down their guard. But as Legadema moved around Makena's body conducting her inspection, something caught her attention that made her freeze in a way that would change everything about the next 3 weeks of her life and challenge every assumption that wildlife scientists held about the rigid boundaries between predator and prey species. There was something on Makena's back, clinging to the dead baboon's fur, something small and moving with weak, uncoordinated gestures that communicated vulnerability and helplessness. Legadema approached cautiously and sniffed this discovery, and her entire body went rigid with a tension that came not from aggression, but from something more complex that observers would later struggle to name or explain. It was a baby baboon, perhaps 2 weeks old, weighing less than half a kilogram, with its tiny fingers still gripped into the fur on its mother's back where infant baboons rode during their first months of life. The baby was alive and apparently uninjured despite the violent kill that had just occurred, and it began making the high-pitched distress calls that infant primates use to summon maternal care when separated from their mothers. Before we continue this extraordinary journey that defied nature's rules, if stories about moments when predatory instinct gives way to maternal compassion across species boundaries touch your heart, consider subscribing to Lion King Stories. Every subscription helps us share more of these remarkable true tales that prove the categories we use to understand animal behavior are more fluid than we assume, and that sometimes the deepest drives that evolution has programmed into predators can be overridden by circumstances and emotions that science is only beginning to understand. Your support helps spread the message that animals are capable of choices that transcend their programming, and that the line between predator and prey can dissolve when the right individual faces the right situation at the right moment in ways that nobody can fully predict or explain. What happened next was witnessed by Ranger John Mavuso, who had been tracking Legadema from a distance of approximately 50 meters using binoculars to observe her hunting behavior as part of ongoing research into predator patterns in this region of the Delta. John had been working in Okavango for 30 years and had documented thousands of hunts and kills, but what he saw through his binoculars in the moments after Legadema discovered the baby baboon was unlike anything in 3 decades of field observation. Legadema didn't kill the infant. She didn't eat it as a secondary food source, the way lions sometimes consumed the young of prey animals after killing adults. Instead, she picked up the baby baboon in her jaws with the same careful gentleness that lionesses used when carrying their own cubs by the scruff, and she turned away from Makena's body and began walking toward a shaded area beneath a cluster of acacia trees approximately 30 meters from the kill site. John radioed immediately to other rangers in the area, using the emergency frequency that was reserved for unusual or significant wildlife observations. "This is John at Grid 9. I need confirmation on something because I don't trust what I'm seeing. Female lion Legadema just killed an adult baboon and is now carrying the baby alive. Not to eat. She's treating it like a cub. Over." The response came back with skepticism that John completely understood because what he was reporting violated fundamental principles of predator-prey relationships. "John, confirm you said carrying alive? Not dead. Over." John confirmed. "Affirmative. Baby baboon is alive, moving, and the lion is being gentle. This is not predatory behavior. I repeat, not predatory behavior. I need additional observers here. Over." Within 40 minutes, 3 additional rangers had arrived at John's position and all of them witnessed the same unprecedented behavior through their binoculars and telephoto camera lenses that would provide documentation essential for later scientific analysis. Legadema had positioned herself in the shade with the baby baboon placed between her front paws, and she was lying in a relaxed posture that lionesses typically adopted when nursing or protecting their own cubs. The baby, who would later be named Kito by the research team documenting this event, was making continuous distress vocalizations that any mother baboon would have responded to immediately. But Legadema remained calm and made no aggressive movements toward the crying infant positioned just centimeters from her face and jaws. To understand why this behavior was so shocking and unprecedented, it's important to understand the normal relationship between lions and baboons in African ecosystems. These species are natural enemies with an antagonistic relationship that spans millions of years of evolutionary history shaped by predation, competition, and mutual threat. Lions hunt baboons as a regular food source, particularly targeting juveniles and isolated individuals who lack the protection of the troop. Baboon troops, in response, have evolved sophisticated alarm systems and mobbing behaviors where multiple adults will cooperatively attack lions who venture too close to the troop, using their sharp canine teeth and numerical advantage to inflict serious injuries that can kill or disable large predators. The idea that a lioness would kill an adult baboon and then adopt the victim's infant rather than killing or abandoning it contradicted everything that wildlife biologists understood about how evolution shaped species interactions and survival strategies. The research team that assembled to document Legadema's behavior with Kito over the following weeks included Dr. Sarah Joubert, a wildlife behaviorist with 20 years of experience studying predator cognition and decision-making in African big cats. Dr. Joubert arrived at the site 2 days after John's initial observation, and she brought with her the professional skepticism that good scientists maintained toward reports of animal behavior that seemed too extraordinary to be credible. Her first hypothesis was that Legadema was engaging in play behavior that would eventually culminate in killing and eating the baby baboon, similar to the way domestic cats sometimes play with injured prey before delivering fatal bites. But as Dr. Joubert reviewed the accumulated footage and observations from the first 48 hours, this hypothesis became untenable because the evidence showed Legadema actively protecting Kito from threats rather than treating him as a toy or future food source. On the second day of the adoption, a spotted hyena had approached the area where Legadema rested with Kito, attracted by the smell of Makena's body, which was still lying 30 meters away where the kill had occurred. Hyenas were aggressive scavengers and opportunistic predators who would readily kill undefended baby animals of any species, and under normal circumstances a baby baboon would be easy prey for a hyena who encountered one without adult protection. But when the hyena moved toward Kito, Legadema's response was immediate and violent. She charged the intruder with aggressive vocalizations and physical displays that communicated clear intent to defend the baby baboon from harm. The hyena retreated quickly, apparently recognizing that Legadema was willing to fight to protect whatever she was guarding, and this interaction provided the first clear evidence that the lioness had formed a protective attachment to Kito rather than viewing him as prey or plaything. The third day brought another remarkable observation that further challenged conventional understanding of the predator-prey boundary. Legadema made a successful kill of a young impala, dragged the carcass to her resting spot with Kito, and began feeding in the normal manner of solitary lions who consumed prey without sharing. But after eating for approximately 15 minutes, Legadema did something that stunned every observer. She picked up a portion of meat in her jaws, carried it toward Kito, who was resting several meters away, and dropped the meat directly in front of the baby baboon. Kito, at 2 weeks old, was far too young to eat solid food and would normally have been nursing exclusively from his mother for several more weeks. But Legadema's attempt to share her kill demonstrated an intention to provide food for the infant she had adopted. Dr. Joubert noted in her field reports that this food-sharing behavior was particularly significant because lions were not naturally inclined to share kills even with pride members except under specific circumstances involving dominance hierarchies and kinship relationships, and they certainly never shared food with prey species under any documented circumstances. The fact that Legadema was attempting to provision Kito suggested that she had mentally recategorized the baby baboon from prey to dependent offspring, in ways that overrode millions of years of evolutionary programming that should have made such behavior impossible. When Dr. Joubert was later interviewed by wildlife documentarians about her initial reactions to witnessing this behavior, she stated simply, "I saw it happen and I still didn't believe it. Everything I learned in 20 years of studying lion behavior said this was impossible. But nature doesn't read textbooks." As the days accumulated and Legadema continued to care for Kito without showing any predatory or aggressive behavior toward him, the research team began investigating possible explanations for why this particular lioness might have made the unprecedented decision to adopt the baby of an animal she had just killed. One significant piece of Legadema's personal history emerged from long-term tracking data that suggested a potential psychological context for her behavior. 6 weeks earlier, Legadema had given birth to 2 cubs who had both died within 5 days from causes that post-mortem examination suggested were related to disease or congenital health problems. Rangers had documented Legadema's distress during that period, noting that she had remained near the dead cubs for 2 full days before finally abandoning them, and that her behavior in the following weeks had shown signs of depression, including reduced hunting activity and social withdrawal from other lions in the area. This recent maternal loss might have created a psychological state where Legadema's maternal instincts were activated but had no appropriate outlet, making her receptive to forming maternal attachments with infants who would normally be categorized as prey rather than offspring. The timing of Kito's appearance in Legadema's life, orphaned and helpless and crying with the same distress vocalizations that mammalian infants universally use to solicit care, might have triggered maternal responses that overrode predatory categorization precisely because Legadema's body and brain were primed for maternal behavior that had recently been denied normal expression. This hypothesis, while speculative, provided at least a plausible framework for understanding why this particular lioness, at this particular moment, had made a choice that contradicted her species' entire evolutionary history. The daily progression of Legadema's care for Kito revealed a learning process where the lioness had to figure out how to mother a species she had never interacted with except as prey, and the adaptations she made demonstrated problem-solving and behavioral flexibility that exceeded what most scientists believed lions possessed. During the first week, Legadema struggled with basic logistics like how to carry Kito when she needed to move to water sources or new resting spots, initially attempting to carry him by the scruff the way lionesses transported cubs. But Kito's anatomy made this difficult, and he would cry out in apparent discomfort when gripped this way. By day 4, rangers observed Legadema experimenting with alternative carrying methods, including supporting Kito's weight more on her tongue and lower jaw rather than gripping with her canines, creating a kind of platform that allowed safer transport even though it was awkward and required Legadema to move slowly and carefully. The grooming behavior that Legadema directed toward Kito was another remarkable example of cross-species maternal care that the research team documented extensively through video footage and still photography. Lions groom their cubs by licking their fur to clean them and stimulate blood circulation, using their rough tongues to remove dirt and parasites and keep the cubs healthy. Legadema applied these same grooming behaviors to Kito despite the obvious physical differences between lion cubs and baby baboons, spending up to 30 minutes at a time licking Kito's fur and face, while the infant made contentment vocalizations that baboons typically directed toward their mothers during social grooming sessions. This grooming served practical purposes by keeping Kito clean, but it also functioned as social bonding that reinforced the attachment between Legadema and the baby she had adopted. The second week brought new challenges as Kito became more mobile and curious about his environment, wanting to explore areas beyond the immediate vicinity of Legadema's resting spots, but lacking the judgment to assess dangers that a baby baboon would normally learn about through observation and guidance from adult troop members. Rangers documented multiple instances where Kito wandered toward potential threats like thorny vegetation or sloped ground that could cause falls, and Legadema consistently intervened by using her paws to gently block Kito's path, or by picking him up and relocating him to safer areas. This supervisory behavior demonstrated that Legadema was tracking Kito's movements and making proactive decisions to protect him from environmental hazards, going beyond simple passive tolerance to active parenting that required attention and energy investment. The most poignant moments documented during the 3-week adoption period involved Legadema's apparent attempts to comfort Kito when the baby baboon became distressed during periods when his basic needs were not being met. Infant baboons require frequent nursing, typically every 2 to 3 hours during their first weeks of life, and Kito would periodically make the crying vocalizations that signal hunger and the need for milk. Legadema could not provide milk, and her incomprehension of Kito's specific needs was evident in her trial-and-error responses to his distress. She would lick him more intensively, trying to soothe him through grooming. She would pick him up and reposition him against her body, perhaps hoping that physical contact would calm him. She would make low rumbling vocalizations that lionesses use when communicating with their cubs, attempting to reassure Kito, even though these lion sounds probably meant nothing to a baby baboon's auditory processing systems. These desperate attempts to mother an infant whose needs she couldn't fully meet created heartbreaking scenes that affected even the most hardened rangers who observed them, because Legadema's intentions were so clearly protective and nurturing, even as her lack of appropriate resources meant that Kito was slowly declining despite her best efforts. By the end of the second week, Kito had lost visible body weight and was showing signs of malnourishment, including dull fur and reduced energy, and the ethical pressure on the research team to intervene was mounting even as they struggled with questions about whether human interference would serve Kito's interests or simply disrupt a natural process that might yield insights more valuable than one infant baboon's survival. The practical challenges of Legadema caring for a baby baboon became increasingly apparent as the days progressed and Kito's needs became more urgent. Infant baboons required frequent nursing and constant physical contact with their mothers, and they rode on their mothers' backs while the troop traveled and foraged for food. Legadema could provide protection and warmth, but she could not provide milk appropriate for a primate infant, and she could not transport Kito effectively when she needed to move to find water or hunt for food. Rangers observed Legadema attempting to carry Kito in her jaws the way lionesses carried cubs, but this transportation method was awkward and potentially dangerous for a baby baboon whose anatomy was different from lion cubs and who risked injury from the pressure of Legadema's bite even when she was being gentle. The research team faced difficult ethical questions about whether to intervene in this situation by removing Kito from Legadema's care and placing him in a wildlife rehabilitation facility where he could receive appropriate food and eventual integration with other baboons. On one hand, Kito was clearly not receiving adequate nutrition and would likely die within another week or two if the situation continued without intervention. On the other hand, Legadema was demonstrating unprecedented maternal behavior toward a member of a prey species, and allowing this natural experiment to continue might provide invaluable insights into animal cognition and the plasticity of instinctive behaviors that science had assumed were rigid and unchangeable. After extensive discussion and consultation with wildlife ethics boards, the decision was made to allow the situation to continue while maintaining close observation and readiness to intervene if Kito showed signs of imminent health crisis. The turning point came on day 18 when rangers observed a baboon troop moving through the area approximately 200 meters from where Legadema was resting with Kito. The troop's vocalizations were clearly audible, and Kito responded with obvious agitation, making sounds and movements that suggested recognition of his own species' communication patterns, even though he had been too young at the time of his mother's death to have developed strong social attachments to the troop. Legadema noticed Kito's response to the baboon vocalizations, and her behavior suggested internal conflict between the maternal attachment she had formed with the baby and recognition that Kito belonged with his own species rather than with a lion who could not provide appropriate long-term care. What followed over the next 72 hours was a gradual process that rangers interpreted as Legadema making the conscious decision to return Kito to his species despite the emotional attachment that had clearly developed during 3 weeks of constant companionship. On day 18, Legadema made no move toward the baboon troop, but instead positioned herself between Kito and the sounds of the approaching baboons, as if protecting him from potential danger posed by his own kind. But by day 19, her behavior had shifted. She began moving in the direction where baboon vocalizations were most frequent, carrying Kito with her, but moving slowly and stopping often as if uncertain about whether to continue. Rangers noted that Legadema's body language during these movements showed signs of stress, including increased tail swishing and frequent pauses to look back in the direction from which they had come, suggesting internal conflict about the decision she was making. Day 20 brought a remarkable scene that was captured on video by Dr. Joubert's research team, and that provided some of the most emotionally powerful footage in the entire documentation of this unprecedented adoption. Legadema had positioned herself at the edge of a clearing where the baboon troop was foraging approximately 50 meters away, and she was lying down with Kito between her paws in the protective posture she had maintained throughout their 3 weeks together. The baby baboon was making sounds in response to the troop's vocalizations, clearly drawn toward his own species, but not yet independent enough to leave Legadema's protection voluntarily. For nearly 2 hours, Legadema remained in this position, not moving forward toward the troop, but not retreating either, as if giving Kito time to make his own decision about whether to stay with the lioness who had mothered him or return to the species he belonged to by birth. The footage shows Legadema repeatedly nuzzling Kito and licking him more intensively than usual, and behavioral experts who later analyzed this video suggested that these increased grooming behaviors might have represented Legadema's way of expressing attachment or perhaps even saying goodbye in the only language she had available. Several times during those 2 hours, Kito would start moving toward the sounds of the baboon troop, and Legadema would gently pull him back with her paw, but these restraints became progressively gentler and less insistent as the afternoon progressed, as if Legadema was slowly accepting what needed to happen even though it meant losing the infant she had protected and cared for. The actual separation occurred late on day 21 in the early morning hours just after dawn, and it was witnessed by Ranger John Mavuso, who had maintained overnight observations specifically because he anticipated that the reunion with the baboon troop was imminent based on Legadema's behavior patterns over the previous days. John's field notes from that morning describe the scene with unusual emotional language for a scientific document. Legadema picked up Kito at 0547 hours and carried him directly toward the baboon troop, who were beginning their morning foraging routine approximately 30 meters away. She walked slowly and deliberately, not stalking but walking upright with Kito visible in her jaws. At 20 meters distance, she stopped and placed Kito on the ground, then stepped back approximately 3 meters and sat down. Kito remained motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, looking back at Legadema, then turned toward the baboon sounds and began moving toward the troop. Legadema watched, but did not follow or attempt to retrieve him. This observer will state clearly that what I witnessed appeared to be a mother making the deliberate choice to give up her child for his own good despite her obvious attachment to him. After 30 years observing wildlife, I have never seen behavior that more clearly demonstrated conscious moral choice. Several female baboons from the troop approached cautiously when they noticed Kito, clearly confused by the situation where an infant baboon was approaching from the direction of a lion who was sitting in clear view rather than hunting or hiding. Baboons have complex social structures and strong maternal instincts, and despite the unusual circumstances, the maternal drive to protect orphaned infants overcame their fear and confusion about how this baby had survived 3 weeks in proximity to a predator. One female, who troop observations suggested had recently lost her own infant to disease, scooped up Kito and immediately began the inspection and grooming behaviors that baboons used when accepting new members into their social groups. Other adult baboons formed a defensive barrier between the female who had claimed Kito and Legadema's position, clearly prepared to mob the lioness if she showed any aggressive intent toward the troop or the baby. But Legadema made no aggressive movements. She sat and watched for approximately 10 minutes as Kito was integrated into the baboon troop and carried away by his new adoptive mother, and rangers reported that the lioness's posture and facial expressions during this watching period suggested something that scientists were reluctant to name, but that every human observer interpreted as grief or loss. When the baboon troop finally moved away into the trees and Kito was no longer visible, Legadema stood, looked once more in the direction they had gone, and then turned and walked away in the opposite direction, resuming her solitary existence as a predator in the Okavango Delta, as if the previous 3 weeks had been a dream or temporary suspension of normal reality that was now definitively over. Dr. Joubert and her team continued monitoring both Legadema and the baboon troop for 6 months following Kito's return to his species, and the observations confirmed that the baby thrived and developed normally after being accepted by the troop, and that Legadema showed no subsequent attempts to adopt or interact unusually with baboons or other prey species. The incident appeared to have been a unique response to a specific set of circumstances, rather than a permanent change in Legadema's behavior or a discovery of some new cross-species relationship that would persist beyond the immediate situation. The long-term monitoring revealed several fascinating details about both Kito's integration into the baboon troop and Legadema's return to normal predatory behavior that provided closure to this extraordinary story. Kito was adopted by a female named Zuri who had lost her own infant 2 months earlier, and who showed immediate maternal attachment to the orphaned baby despite his unusual recent history of being cared for by a predator. Zuri's troop accepted Kito without apparent discrimination or rejection, and within 2 weeks observers noted that Kito was displaying normal baboon social behaviors, including play with other juveniles, and the beginning of solid food consumption that supplemented the nursing that Zuri provided. By 3 months post-reunion, Kito was indistinguishable from other baboons his age in terms of development and social integration, suggesting that the 3 weeks he spent with Legadema had not created lasting trauma or behavioral abnormalities that would impair his ability to function as a normal member of his species. The most poignant aspect of the long-term observations involved several occasions when Legadema and the baboon troop crossed paths in overlapping territories, creating situations where the lioness and the baby she had mothered were in proximity, but separated by the species barrier that had temporarily dissolved but now reasserted itself. Rangers documented 3 such encounters during the 6-month monitoring period, and in each case the pattern was similar. Legadema would notice the baboon troop, pause in her movement, and watch from a distance without approaching or showing hunting interest, while the baboons would engage in their normal alarm and defensive behaviors that any predator's presence triggered, forming protective clusters around vulnerable juveniles, including Kito, and positioning adult males at the perimeter ready to mob if the lion came too close. What made these encounters remarkable was what Legadema didn't do rather than what she did. On one occasion, a juvenile baboon from the troop became separated from the main group and was foraging alone approximately 30 meters from Legadema's position, presenting exactly the kind of vulnerable prey opportunity that lions would normally exploit without hesitation. But Legadema did not hunt this baboon. She watched it for several minutes, then deliberately turned and moved away in a different direction, passing up an easy meal in a way that rangers interpreted as possible recognition that these particular baboons were the group that contained Kito and therefore should not be harmed. While this interpretation required attributing sophisticated social recognition and memory to Legadema that went beyond what most lion cognition research supported, the behavior pattern was consistent across multiple observations and suggested that something about her 3-week experience mothering a baby baboon had created lasting changes in how she related to this specific troop even after Kito had been returned. The scientific papers that Dr. Joubert eventually published about this case focused on several theoretical frameworks for understanding what had occurred and what it revealed about the flexibility of instinctive behaviors and the role of individual experience in shaping how animals responded to situations that fell outside their evolutionary programming. One paper examined the neurological basis of maternal behavior in mammals and proposed that the hormonal and neural systems that mediated parental care were relatively nonspecific about the exact characteristics of offspring, meaning that under the right circumstances maternal responses could be triggered by infants of other species if those infants displayed the universal signals of helplessness and need that activated caregiving systems across mammalian species. This framework suggested that Legadema's adoption of Kito was not a complete anomaly, but rather an extreme example of a general principle where maternal instinct could override species-specific recognition when the appropriate triggers were present. Another paper focused on the psychological impact of reproductive loss and grief in social animals, arguing that Legadema's recent experience of losing her own cubs had created a state of unresolved maternal motivation that made her unusually receptive to forming attachments with any infant who presented appropriate stimuli for parental care. This perspective drew parallels to documented cases in other species where bereaved mothers had adopted infants from different species, or even inanimate objects that resembled infants, suggesting that the drive to nurture could be powerful enough to overcome normal boundaries when circumstances aligned in particular ways. The paper proposed that understanding these edge cases of cross-species adoption provided insights into the fundamental nature of maternal motivation and the extent to which learned versus instinctive factors shaped parenting behaviors. Perhaps the most philosophically significant aspect of Legadema's story was what it revealed about moral capacity in non-human animals, and the extent to which individuals could make choices that transcended their biological programming in ways that deserve to be called ethical decisions rather than merely instinctive responses. The deliberate nature of Legadema's decision to return Kito to his troop, despite the emotional attachment she had clearly formed, suggested a level of self-sacrifice and consideration for the infant's welfare that went beyond automatic behaviors and implied something resembling conscious moral reasoning about what would be best for Kito, even when it conflicted with Legadema's own desires to keep the baby she had mothered. For 3 weeks. If this story moved you, if it challenged your assumptions about the rigid boundaries between predator and prey, and made you consider that maternal instinct might be a force powerful enough to temporarily override millions of years of evolutionary programming, we would be honored if you would share your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed an animal making a choice that seemed to contradict its nature, or training in ways that proved they were more than just biological machines following instinctive scripts? Please subscribe to Lion King Stories for more incredible true tales from the wild that prove animals are capable of moral complexity and emotional depth that exceeds our comfortable categories. That sometimes the most profound transformations occur in the space between heartbeats when a predator looks at its prey and chooses compassion over hunger. And that nature's rules are not as absolute as we teach in textbooks when individual animals face choices that require them to decide who they want to be rather than simply what they were programmed to be. Thank you for being part of our pride.